Okay, this is our program on the human reproductive system. We're going to introduce both female and male reproductive systems, talk about how those systems function, the hormonal control, the anatomy of those systems, kind of what they do. We'll also talk about birth control. And so there I have a picture of two people with functioning reproductive systems, Kate Beckinsale and I think Daniel Craig. Um, and so I won't say anything more about that as other than they have functioning reproductive systems. Okay, so we'll talk with male and female reproductive systems. So first of all, in the sexual reproduction requires both males and females, and it involves cells from both the male and female uniting to form a new individual. In the reproductive systems of both males and females, normal body cells that have 46 chromosomes go through a process called meiosis, where the number of chromosomes are cut in half. They have 23 chromosomes. And this allows then for, after these cells from male and female unite, they'll restore the normal number of body cells, a diploid number, 46, and that will produce a new individual, which will be some random combination of the traits of both the male and female parent. This is really about producing offspring that have new combinations of traits. And so this happens in the ovary in females and in the testes of males. And so those are really the main reproductive organs. They're the ones producing these special cells that are going to be called sperm and egg or sperm and oocyte, and they're also going to be reproducing the sex hormones. In the male system, so then the testes are producing these cells by meiosis. We call them sperm, and they're also producing the primary sex hormone, testosterone. Okay, and then there's a bunch of other structures in the male reproductive system that we refer to as accessory structures. Some of these are tubes that will carry the the sperm to the outside of the body. These include the epididymis, vas deferens, and the urethra. And the urethra will go through the penis. And then there's a series of glands that will add their secretion to the sperm to form semen, and that will nourish the sperm, protect them, and activate them. And I'm really only going to talk about the prostate gland out of those. Okay, and so there's the male reproductive system from an external view. I think that's Michelangelo. Let's look at an internal view. So this is a medial section. The testes are outside the body in the scrotum, and that's where testosterone is produced, and that's where the sex cells, the male sex cells, sperm are made, and those cells have to mature there. The reason they're in the scrotum outside the body cavity is because this process really occurs several degrees lower than body temperature. It can't occur at body temperature. And so the testes produce the sperm in the scrotum, and then that sperm is stored in the epididymis. Okay, during the sexual arousal and activation, sperm will leave the epididymis and enter the vas deferens or ductus deferens as shown here, and this loops back up into the body cavity, kind of behind the urinary bladder, and that's where, as it loops back into the body cavity, it will get secretions from the several glands, including the prostate gland, and that prostate gland occurs at the base of the urinary bladder, and it surrounds kind of a short, enlarged portion of the vas deferens called the ejaculatory duct, and then the urethra goes through the prostate where it receives its secretions and enters the penis, and the penis contains the erectile tissue, which will allow the insertion of the penis into the female reproductive system when males are aroused, and then the urethra passes right through that. So that's the male reproductive system: the testes, some tubes, some glands, and then the erectile tissues in the penis for the delivery of sperm. Okay, the control of the male reproductive response. I don't know why I have wrestlers there, but it just seemed very male. Um, the control of this system is really controlled in part by the brain. The hypothalamus is the region of the brain that receives information from various parts of the emotional brain, the thalamus, which is receiving incoming sensory information, and the hypothalamus contains centers that are associated with reproduction. The hypothalamus itself releases a hormone called gonadotropin releasing hormone, or GnRH. And this hormone passes down to the anterior part of the pituitary gland, which is part of the endocrine system. And if that hormone's being secreted, the pituitary gland will release follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Luteinizing hormone is LH, follicle stimulating hormone is FSH, and luteinizing hormone also has another name, interstitial cell stimulating hormone. But if you just know FSH and LH, you'll be fine. So these hormones are produced in response to gonadotropin releasing hormone, and they travel throughout the body until they reach the testes. That's the target tissue for them. And this will cause the testes to release testosterone. And that testosterone is the male reproductive hormone, which will then control male reproductive activities in others. And the environment has an impact on this, and this is part of a negative feedback system. The testes inhibits the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone, which then slows down the production of FSH and LH. So if testosterone gets too high, that can inhibit this. Well, the effects of testosterone, I usually make a joke here about what does testosterone do? It makes men intelligent and good looking. Well, that's only part of it, and that's kind of subjective. But testosterone is a hormone. I mentioned that it's going to promote the development of the sperm, but it's also needed for the development of male anatomy. It's also needed for males to continue sperm production and have male traits. And these male traits, we often refer to them as male secondary sex characteristics. Testosterone has a big boost on growth and metabolism. It determines the distribution of body fat. It determines the pattern of hair growth, facial hair, hair on the torso and in pubic regions, under the arms, even male pattern baldness is response to testosterone. It also has effects on the cardiovascular system, the brain, the nervous system, on behavior, decision making, all sorts of things like that. So a more analytical approach to this is looking at this basic diagram, and it shows the pituitary gland enlarged, and then it shows the inhibitory and stimulatory effects of different hormones. The hypothalamus releases gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH. The anterior pituitary then releases LH and FSH. Okay, these stimulate actions in the testes, which result in the production of sperm and in the production of testosterone. Testosterone also assists in the production of sperm, and it's important for the development of the sex organs and secondary sex characteristics. Okay, testosterone strongly inhibits the release of gonadotropin releasing hormone and LH and FSH. Okay, so that seems like a pretty simple system, and it works pretty well. Let's look at the female reproductive system. Like men, females have a primary reproductive organ. For them, it's the ovary. By meiosis, the ovary produces the gametes or oocytes or egg cells that the female produces. It also stimulates the production of female hormones, reproductive hormones, but there's two of these. They are estrogen and progesterone. The accessory parts of the female reproductive system include the oviduct, the uterus, and cervix, which is really a part of the uterus, the vagina, which is sometimes called the birth canal, and then the vulva and clitoris, or external anatomy of a female reproductive system. Okay, there's, I think that's the birth of Venus there. Let's actually look at the diagram of the human reproductive system. So here's a section view of the female reproductive system. On the right there is the part of the digestive tract. On the left there you can see the pubic bone and then the gallbladder, or not gallbladder, urinary bladder right behind it. The female reproductive system, I mentioned the ovary is actually internal. It's in the lower part of the pelvic cavity, and then it's connected by an oviduct or uterine tube, which is a very thin tube, to the uterus. When the egg is released, it travels down that oviduct to eventually the uterus, where if there's a fertilization, it may implant. And the uterus is the site of development of an embryo into a baby. And then a portion of the uterus projects into the vagina. That's the cervix that contains the opening to the uterus. And then the vagina projects to the as the external opening, and that orifice is part of the vulva. And just like the male reproductive system, there are some protective layers around that. We refer to those as the labia and the mons pubis. And then there's also some female erectile tissue around the opening of the vagina and at the clitoris, just anterior to the urethral opening. Okay, let's look in a little more detail on a frontal view of just the upper part of the system. There are two ovaries connected by that oviduct or uterine tube to the uterus. The uterus is a relatively muscular, thick-walled chamber that has a lining called the endometrium, which will serve to nourish the developing offspring. Okay, and that development takes place in the uterus, and then that opening to the uterus is the cervix, and that will project into the vagina. Okay, like men, females have a very similar control system for their reproductive system, but things are a little more complicated. Like men, the hypothalamus releases gonadotropin-releasing hormone, GnRH, and the endocrine system then responds by producing FSH and LH. Okay, and that will cause the ovaries to produce estrogen and progesterone. But in females, it's more complicated because females are also going to nourish the offspring after birth. And so they have to develop breast tissue that can produce the milk that's going to nourish the offspring. And they have to have a mechanism for the release of that milk. And so there are additional hormones from the pituitary gland. Both prolactin and oxytocin are involved in reproduction for the females. And likewise, these two respond to the environment, and there's negative feedback cycles and some positive feedback cycles actually here as well. Okay, so these in females, again, estrogen and progesterone are needed for the development of female anatomy, although female anatomy primarily develops just because of the absence of testosterone. But the fully functional female anatomy requires estrogen and progesterone. Estrogen and progesterone are also really important for preparing the uterus, and these are produced as follicles develop and help the follicles develop into egg cells. And then you have prolactin and oxytocin as well, and these are important in breast development. In females, the estrogen and progesterone are also responsible for secondary sex characteristics. These are the markers of femaleness that we're all familiar with. Female skin and fat distribution are due to the presence of estrogen. That's why even females who are really athletic and in good shape, always appear less muscular than men because they have thicker skin with more fat stored evenly around the skin. They're also better at things like controlling temperature by changing blood flow distribution and things like that. Estrogen is also a pretty strong boost on the growth and metabolism, and it affects brain and nervous system development, decision making, and things like that. Just like with men, these FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone are involved in negative feedback cycles. These things promote the development of the follicle. They also promote the development of the uterus, particularly the lining of the uterus that are needed for when a woman's pregnant, and that uterine lining has to support the infant. Okay, here we're going to go to the big diagram. Okay, you don't have to know this, but the female control of reproductive system is more complicated than the males. They have different stages in about a 28 to 30 day cycle that prepares the uterine lining each month for the possible deposition of a fertilized egg. The first part of the cycle is referred to as the menstrual phase, when the lining from the last cycle is shed. At this time, there's relatively low levels of estrogen and progesterone. And after that lining is shed, the levels of luteinizing hormone and particular follicle stimulating hormone start to rise. And as follicle stimulating hormone starts to rise, it causes little areas in the follicle or little areas in the ovary called follicle to start developing. And these follicles, each of them contain a cell that has gone through meiosis and is going to produce an egg cell. And as that follicle matures, the cells around that egg cell proliferate, and those cells are the ones that are going to produce estrogen. And so these growing follicles produce more and more estrogen, and estrogen levels rise. And this happens during what's called the proliferative phase of the cycle. And this increasing estrogen causes the uterine lining to start to thicken. And so the endometrium, that lining, becomes thicker and thicker. As levels of estrogen begin to rise, that causes a negative feedback system that eventually will cause FSH levels to drop, but it'll cause LH levels to surge. And this surge results in the rupture of a follicle, and that's called ovulation, where a mature egg cell is released from the follicle, and the remains of the follicle form what's called the corpus luteum, and that continues to secrete hormones. However, at this point, it secretes progesterone, and progesterone causes the lining to remain thick and to become more glandular. And this is a lining that's prepared for the deposition of a fertilized egg. If no egg is present over a while, eventually the high levels of progesterone inhibit FSH and LH, and those levels drop, and that causes the corpus luteum to degenerate. Okay, unless an egg is implanted, and the egg will send a signal that will maintain progesterone levels, and so the lining won't be shed. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about birth control. And your book goes through the methods, and there's a lot of detail in your book, and it's really good. But I want to say a little bit about why we should control births, why we need these methods of contraception. And first of all, these can sometimes be controversial topics, but they shouldn't be. Okay, we know women that give birth at certain times are more healthy than women that give birth at other times. And we know children that are born under certain conditions do far better than children that aren't. For instance, we know women that give birth during their teenage years tend to have poor health, and their infants don't do as well. And that's not just measured by growth, that's measured by long-term outcomes like educational attainment, income levels as adults, all sorts of things like that. We also know that women and children, if women have children that are spaced very closely, like a year or a year and a half, that those children tend to do poorly, and those women have health problems. They'll have thin and weakening bones. Their reproductive system will be damaged. They'll have poor health in a long-term way. So it's really important to space births out so that women can control when and where and how they're going to give birth. And so this birth control can help them do that. And so it's not just about convenience, it's about health outcomes and outcomes for children. Okay, I'm going to just say a little bit about some of the behavioral methods. Um, your book talks about abstinence or periodic abstinence and withdrawal. These methods are favored by some conservative critics, but there's lots of data on them that show that they're less effective means of birth control. And even abstinence, people that take abstinence vows for religious reasons often break those vows and have children after having unprotected sex. Okay. Some of the simplest methods of birth control are barrier contraceptions, things like the diaphragm, the male condom, the female condom. These block the entry of sperm into the female reproductive tract and so prevent pregnancy by preventing that. These are often low cost methods. They still fail occasionally, but they have the advantage, particularly the male condom, of reducing the transmission of sexually transmitted disease, and so can be very nice in that way. There are also a whole series of hormonal methods, pills, injections, rings, patches. These methods use synthetic forms of female hormones, particularly progesterone, to inhibit the release of other hormones, FSH and LH. And so that prevents the development of a mature oocyte and prevents ovulation. Okay, when taken prior to intercourse, these things prevent pregnancy. They don't cause abortion. There's some misconceptions sometimes. And then there are also surgical methods of contraception. The vasectomy is the clipping of the vas deferens, the male tube that delivers sperm. Okay, a very easy operation that can be done as an outpatient and is very effective. For females, the surgical operation is a tubal ligation. It's cutting the oviducts. Much more serious surgery, but also effective. Okay, I'll stop there. Read over these methods of birth control in the book. I'd be happy to answer any questions.